Okay, so we're talking about what causes increases in VO2 max as a result of endurance training. We went into a lot of detail and we listed the 9 adaptations, and I said you needed to be able to explain how each of those 9 adaptations causes the increases in VO2 max, and you're supposed to spend some time on those maps. I'm actually not going to spend a lot of time in class. Normally, I spend a lot of time in class on this, and then I expect your answer to be very detailed on the test. I'm not going to spend time in class on it because I'm just looking at the schedule and we're really far behind. So I'm supposed to be starting chapter 10 today, and I haven't finished chapter 11. So I'm not going to spend time on it in class. I'm not going to expect as much detail on the test. Okay, but you will have to explain some of those adaptations and how they contribute to VO2 max. So make sure, and you're not going to know which ones you're going to have to explain. So make sure you do spend some time on that. But I'll be telling my PLFs that it's not going to be as detailed as I normally do it. Okay, you just have to be able to explain in a way that shows me that you understand how it's contributing. Okay, do you guys have any questions about the maps that you work on? Did you get stuck on any of them and you want me to help you through it?
Could you go over the line from arterial autoregulation to an increase in stroke volume?
Sure. So arterial autoregulation. So I don't know if I did this in this class. So if you're trying to show how something causes an increase in stroke volume, you're going to want to go this way and figure out where it fits in here. So where would arterial autoregulation fit in here? Do you remember?
Systolic volume.
I'm sorry?
And systolic volume.
Right, by doing what? How's it going to affect end systolic volume?
By decreasing resistance.
Yes, good. So if we decrease resistance through arterial autoregulation, that's an increase in radius, right?
Mm-hmm.
So endurance training gives us an increase in arterial autoregulation, which increases our vessel radius, decreases resistance, which increases stroke volume, which increases cardiac output, which increases VO2 max. Right, so anything that you're trying to explain how it's going to go through stroke volume has got to fit in one of these places. Okay, anything that's going through AVO2 difference has got to fit in with the delivery, uptake, and consumption. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, so let's just move on the table. Okay, if there's not something you want to ask me about to review, I'm just going to move on and finish the table. Okay, so lactate threshold is next. Ariel, can you give me a definition of lactate threshold?
It's the point at which lactic acid begins to accumulate as intensity increases. Perfect.
Okay, so how does a trained person's lactate threshold compare to an untrained person? Is it higher, lower, or the same? It's for everyone. Okay, everyone's pointing up. That's good. Can someone explain to me how or why lactate threshold is higher in a trained person?
I can.
Go ahead, Shannon.
I said since there would be less lactic acid due to the 4 sisters with capillary density, mitochondria, myoglobin, oxidative enzymes.
Good. So less lactic acid is being produced therefore lactate threshold is higher. Good. Let me take that a little bit farther, since we're at the end of the semester. And can you explain, it doesn't have to be you, Shannon, can anyone explain why lactic acid production decreases as we get those 4 adaptations? How do those 4 adaptations, or how do those adaptations cause a decrease in lactic acid production? Roxanne, you want to try?
So because there's more myoglobin and all of that, as you go through glycolysis, the hydrogen that's being produced is being able to go over to the electron transport chain. So it's being processed, therefore less hydrogen would be going to the lactate or the pyruvate and causing lactic acid.
Right. So partially because of the myoglobin, but also because of the mitochondria, right? So remember that the reason lactic acid was being produced was because we were running out of space in the electron transport chain, right, for these hydrogens. So we were increasing our exercise intensity, and we were overwhelming our electron transport chain. But a trained person, so this electron transport chain is happening in the mitochondria. So this trained person has more mitochondria and bigger mitochondria. Okay, it's like completely remodeling the bathroom in the Staples Center, and now you have more stalls and more bathrooms, and so the hydrogens can be dropped off here. So less of it gets dropped off at the pyruvate, and therefore less lactic acid is being produced. Okay, so you've got to make those connections. Now, if you memorize that step of sequences why lactic acid production was increasing, now you've got to understand where it fits in here with training. The training helps you produce less lactic acid because you have more mitochondria where you can accept the hydrogens in, so less gets produced. So now you can be working at a higher intensity before you start accumulating lactic acid, which by definition is a higher lactate threshold. Okay, any questions on that? Okay, could we also say here we get an increase in bicarbonate buffer? I'm seeing everybody say yes, and Roxanne saying no. Roxanne, why not? You gotta unmute yourself.
Sorry, I thought I pressed the button. So an increase in bicarbonate buffer would be the result of a higher intensity training. So that wouldn't be endurance training.
Right, so we're specifically, remember when we're filling out this table, we're specifically talking about endurance training. We're gonna get to high intensity interval training in a few minutes as soon as we finish this table, but right now we're only talking about endurance training. Endurance training does not increase your bicarbonate buffer because endurance training by definition is below your lactate threshold. So you're not stressing that pathway, so it's not going to adapt. Okay, so if I ask you why endurance training or how endurance training causes an increase in lactate threshold, bicarbonate buffer is not the right answer. Okay, it's the other adaptations, the endurance adaptations in the type 1 fibers that you're going to activate through endurance training, and you need to explain how those increase lactate threshold, specifically how it causes a decrease in lactic acid production. And it's no longer okay just to say it causes a decrease in lactic acid production. You now have to explain how it causes a decrease in lactic acid production and why that means a higher lactate threshold. Okay, any questions on that? Okay, blood pH. So trained person and untrained person both jogging at 6 miles per hour. How does the trained person's blood pH compare to the untrained person? Higher, lower, or the same? Emily says higher. Gwen says higher. Rachel says higher. Alexa says higher. Justin says higher. Okay, Justin, why is it higher?
I'm trying to think, like my mind's a little cluttered. I know it's higher though.
Okay, Rachel, why is it higher?
Because you're not accumulating that hydrogen And that hydrogen is what lowers your pH. So if you're working to low to moderate intensity, remember those bathrooms got upgraded. So our mitochondria, we have more space to bring in those hydrogen in the electron transport chain. So that means that we're not going to have the accumulation of that hydrogen, which leads to the lactic acid.
Right. So at the same intensity, the trained person, because they have a higher lactate threshold, is going to be producing less lactic acid. The hydrogen from the lactic acid is what makes the blood more acidic. Therefore, be less acidic, therefore pH would be higher. Plasma volume, trained person versus an untrained person. Glenn says higher. Good. So we've already listed that on as one of our adaptations as an increase in plasma volume, but we haven't talked about why. So let me tell you about the mechanism behind that. So it's a two-step process to get an increase in plasma volume as a result of endurance training. The first one is increased albumin. Albumin is a protein in your blood that prevents some of the plasma going into the muscle. So remember that one of the reasons plasma went down during exercise is 1 from sweating and 2 from plasma going into the muscle. So a trained person will have an increase in albumin. Therefore, less of their plasma will go into the muscle, which will be a higher plasma volume. The second part will be an increase in antidiuretic hormone. Antidiuretic hormone. What is a diuretic?
Makes you pee.
Right. A diuretic increases urine production. So an antidiuretic would decrease urine production, which would therefore boost your plasma volume. Okay, so this is a two-step process for what causes the increases in plasma volume as a result of endurance training. Okay, red blood cell count in a trained person, higher, lower, or the same? That's an easy one because we already listed increase in red blood cells as one of our primary adaptations. Okay, you're not going to need to explain why for this one. Endurance training triggers a protein called erythropoietin, which is what causes you to produce red blood cells. I'm not going to ask you about that. You don't need to explain why. Just know that red blood cells increase. Red blood cell production increases as a result of endurance training. Hematocrit in a trained person versus an untrained person. Do you think hematocrit is higher, lower, or the same? Rachel says higher. This one you have to think about a little bit. Pam says higher. Emily says lower. Gwen says lower.
Higher.
Tatiana said higher.
Yes.
Okay, why is it higher?
It's higher because the blood has to maintain a certain percentage to maintain homeostasis, the 45 to 55%. So if the plasma increases, then the hematocrit must also increase.
If the plasma increases, hematocrit would increase?
Is that wrong?
Well, hematocrit, you can think of hematocrit as thickness.
Okay.
So is an increase in plasma going to cause an increase in hematocrit? But think about, so you have to think about what's happening with our red blood cells and with our plasma. So Gwen is now saying stay the same. Emily says down. Emily, why do you think it's down? Lower.
Because if you have an increase in red blood cells, there's going to be like an increase in plasma. So the hematocrit's going to decrease to keep like the ratio.
Okay, so we know that red blood cells are increasing and we know that plasma is increasing. Okay, so let's take a look at what hematocrit is. This is a vial of our blood. Formed elements divided by total blood volume is hematocrit. So if red blood cells and plasma are both increasing, if red blood cells increase more than plasma, hematocrit would be higher. right? If plasma increases more than red blood cells, hematocrit would be lower. If they increase the same amount, hematocrit would be the same. Which do you think is happening? Let me ask you this. Which would be most beneficial?
If the plasma was higher than or increased more than the red blood cells.
Mm-hmm. Remember when I was first going over the hematocrit, I said best case scenario is to have an increase in red blood cells so we have a higher oxygen carrying capacity, right? So we can deliver and consume more oxygen, but also have a large increase in plasma so that hematocrit stays low. Because of the issue of if hematocrit increases, it means the blood is thick, and which means viscosity increases, which means resistance increases. It's gonna be harder to get blood flow to the muscle. So we want red blood cells high, but we want hematocrit low, which means we need a large increase in plasma. And remember I said endurance training gives you the best case scenario, the best case scenario to help you get the best performance possible. And that's an increase in red blood cells, so we have a higher oxygen carrying capacity, and even larger increase in plasma so that hematocrit goes down. Okay, so we end up with a decreased hematocrit. Mary, you have a question?
Yeah, so are we comparing plasma volume to hematocrit, not necessarily red blood cell count, right?
What do you mean comparing plasma volume?
So when you said that when we're looking at plasma, we're looking at if plasma is higher, is more than hematocrit, not necessarily maintaining the same percentage of blood or the same volume of blood. So it's good that we have increase in plasma, but we want to make sure that we don't have too much plasma higher than hematocrit. Is that right?
Well, plasma can't be higher than hematocrit because
Right.
hematocrit is like a ratio.
Okay, so it's not necessarily only red blood cells, it's just all the formed elements put together.
Yes.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Yeah, when I say red blood cells, I mean
Okay, got it. Thank
but
you.
it's our increase in red blood cells that we're most concerned
with. Okay.
Okay, so everybody okay with the hematocrit? Okay. Blood pressure. I'm not going to go into this one. We went into detail on it with exercise. With training, I'll just say, it's normal for blood pressure to increase with exercise. So training is not really going to affect submax blood pressure unless the person was hypertensive to begin with, in which case it could cause a decrease. But for someone who has normal blood pressure to begin with, the endurance training should not really affect their blood pressure. Okay, and the last one is RER. I'm going to assume at this point that you know what RER is and what it means. So how does a trained person's RER, so if both the trained person and the untrained person are both jogging at 6 miles per hour, how does the trained person's RER compare to the untrained person? Rachel and Emily say lower. AJ says lower. AJ, why is it lower?
It's lower because you're working aerobically, so you're relying more on fat instead of carbs, so it'll bring your RER closer to 0.7.
Good, and that's also related to the lactate threshold, right? Remember that the lactate threshold basically separates primarily aerobic work from primarily anaerobic work. So the higher the intensity, the more you're going to rely on carbohydrates because you're working anaerobically. So at this point now, you need to link that to the lactate threshold, and you need to link that to the crossover concept and explain why we use carbohydrates at the higher intensity. Remember, and we talked about because we're working anaerobically, because we're using our fast twitch fibers, the higher intensities, those work anaerobically, so we have to use carbohydrates. Okay, when we get to the final, you have to link all those things together.
And
okay?
Also the ventilatory threshold too?
I mean, that doesn't answer the RER question. I mean, it's related, you could certainly link that in there, but that doesn't answer the RER question. Okay, questions on anything from the table? We finished both sides of the table.
What did you say about blood pressure again? I missed it real quick.
For a person who has normal blood pressure, endurance training is not going to affect their blood pressure.
Okay.
Because an increase in blood pressure during exercise is normal. It's not a bad thing. Roxanne, go ahead.
Okay, for some reason my button's not working. Sorry. For some reason, I just want to make sure that I understood that hematocrit is going to stay the same because the increase in red blood cell and the increase in plasma, essentially that ratio would be the same as if it were previous. Did I have that right?
Hematocrit goes down in a trained person
Okay.
because of the large increases in plasma.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep. Evelyn, go ahead.
You said to link RER to the crossover concept. What other things to link into?
Lactate threshold.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. All of those things relate to the use of the reliance on carbohydrates at the higher intensities. Okay, any other questions on anything from the table? Okay, then we are done with endurance training and we are going to shift to anaerobic training. We're still in chapter 11. Okay, chapter 11 is adaptations to training. We just started with endurance training, which I have on the table. Now we're going to anaerobic training, specifically high intensity interval training, not resistance training. Resistance training is the next chapter. Okay, right now we're talking about high intensity interval training. So when we were talking about endurance training and aerobic fitness, what was our best measurement of aerobic fitness?
VO2
Anyone can just jump in and answer. Nick, go ahead.
VO2 max.
VO2 max. And how did we test that? What's it called when we test your VO2 max?
Was it the indirect calorimetry?
Indirect calorimetry. Remember, where we're measuring your oxygen consumption and carbon dioxide production, and we have you increasing intensity. And we're looking at how those gas exchanges are. Okay, so indirect calorimetry is how we measure VO2 max, which is our best measure of aerobic fitness. Okay, so now we need to talk about how we measure anaerobic fitness. Okay, so this test is called the Wingate test. And back when I used to teach the labs, we used to do the Wingate test in the 346 lab, but they don't do it anymore, so I'll explain it to you. So the Wingate test is on a cycloergometer. You start out with no load on the cycloergometer and you start pedaling your legs really fast. Okay, we drop the load and start the clock. Okay, the load is based on your body weight and it's heavy. Okay, and when I say drop the load, it's literally drop the load because the cycloergometer has a flywheel with a strap. And we literally attach a basket to the edge of the strap and the basket has weights in it. Okay, so there's not a gradual increase in load like if I was to turn on a spinning bike. It's automatically the load is there completely. Okay, so you're pedaling really fast on the bike against no load. We drop the load, start the clock. You have to pedal as fast as you can against this load for 30 seconds. It's a 30-second test. It's incredibly intense. Okay, a lot of people at the end of this test throw up, which is probably one of the reasons they don't do it in 346 lab anymore. It's a very intense test. So imagine yourself on a stationary bike, pedaling as fast as you can, and then suddenly there's a really heavy load, and you have to try, you're not gonna be able to increase your speed. You have to try to maintain your speed for 30 seconds. Okay, so within that 30-second test, let's draw it like this. So this is our 30-second test. Within this 30 seconds, where do you think you'd have your fastest speed? The beginning, the middle, or the end? Just jump in with an answer here because I can't see you guys.
The beginning.
The beginning. Why the beginning?
Because that's when you would be using your ATP PCR system.
Exactly. The first 10 seconds will be your highest power output because that's when you're in your ATP PCR system. That's when you're activating your 2X fibers. That's when you can produce the most force. Okay, so in the first 10 seconds, you'll hit your peak power. Peak power is your highest power output. After about 10 seconds, you're gonna start slowing down significantly, okay? Because you no longer have access to that system. You no longer have access to that those fibers. You're going to shift into your 2A fibers. You're going to shift into glycolysis, which means you're accumulating lactic acid. Okay, this is not just barely above your lactate threshold. This is way above your lactate threshold maximal. Okay, we've exhausted the 2X fibers. Now, by the time you get to 15, 20 seconds, your legs are going to be on fire with lactic acid. And you've still got to sprint another 15 seconds. It's incredibly intense. Okay. So I think they might do it in the 446 lab, but not everybody gets to do it. They just take volunteers. So you can plan for that if you want. So your average power over the entire 30 seconds is your mean power. Okay, peak power is your highest power output, which is achieved in the first 10 seconds of the Wingate test. Mean power is the average power over the entire 30-second test. And that is the measure of our anaerobic fitness, is our mean power. So, do you think it's possible to increase your mean power? It is. Do you think it's possible to increase your peak power? It is. What kind of training do you think would do that?
High intensity interval training.
Intensity anaerobic interval training will increase your peak power and your mean power, your anaerobic fitness. Okay, we have two anaerobic systems. What are they?
ATP, PCR, and glycolysis.
Right. So we're going to go through each of those systems separately, talk about how you train it, and what adaptations you'd expect to get from training that system and how that's going to affect your performance on the Wingate test. Okay, so we're going to start with the ATP PCR system. Quick review. Where does this occur?
Sarcoplasm.
Okay. Substrate.
PCR.
Yeah.
Good. Rate limiting enzyme.
Creatine kinase.
Good. How long can you stay in this system?
10 to 15 seconds.
Okay. How long does it take to recover the system?
3 to 5 minutes.
Good. Okay, so give me an example of an exercise you could do in the system.
Sprint, all out sprint.
Okay, for about how long?
10 to 15 seconds.
Okay, so let's say we take a 10-second sprint. Is your workout going to be going out to the track, do 1 10-second sprint, and then go home? That's your workout? Or are you going to do repeats?
Repeats.
You're going to do repeats, okay? How much rest do you get in between?
3 minutes.
Minimum 3 minutes, okay? If you don't take that long, all of the rest of your sprints will be in glycolysis, which is fine. But right now we're trying to stay in the system and train specifically the system. So if you want to train specifically the system, you have to have about 3 to 5 minutes of rest in between your sprints. And then your next sprint will be in the system, okay? So what this will look like if you're training somebody for this, you'll take them out to the track, you'll warm them up. They'll do a 10-second sprint. You'll chat with them for 3 minutes. They'll do another 10-second sprint. They might be on their phone for 3 minutes. They'll do another 10-second sprint, and then they're just gonna sit and pick at the grass for 3 minutes. And by the time you finish this workout, assuming they're paying you, let's say, I don't know, $75 for the hour workout, they're not gonna be very happy because they spent a lot more time resting than they did training. So unless they're an elite athlete that's training this way for a reason, the average person is not going to be real happy training this way. And side note on this, if you do 1 10-second sprint, so I mean you warm up first and you do 1 10-second sprint, will you be out of breath? Why or why not? This is a good critical thinking test question.
No.
No,
No.
Vanessa, why not?
because you're out of breath once you reach glycolysis.
Okay, what causes you to be out of breath?
The clearing of lactic acid.
Can you explain that?
Okay, so the clearing of lactic acid is only possible in glycolysis. It's due to the bicarbonate buffer, where we produce CO2 at the end with H2O. So, and that doesn't happen in ATP PCR.
Okay, good. So, but finish that connection. Why does the carbon dioxide make you out of breath? Can anybody finish that?
It triggers inspiratory centers in the brain, and there's not enough of CO2 being made to start the ventilatory threshold, or to make you feel like you need to inspire.
Well, that's hyperventilation. So that's a separate issue. This is normal during high intensity exercise, that we produce carbon dioxide with a bicarbonate buffer, which triggers the inspiratory centers to increase your breathing rate. That's normal. So it's not an issue of blowing off too much carbon dioxide here. This is clearing lactic acid so we can continue exercising. But what I need you guys to do is make that connection. So you've got that the bicarbonate buffer goes there and creates carbon dioxide, and you understand that's related to breathlessness, but you've got to finish making that connection by the carbon dioxide triggering the inspiratory centers in your brain to speed up your breathing rate. Okay. AJ, what did you want to add?
Oh, I was going to add, like if you're in the ATP PCR system, then the reason for fatigue is the depletion of PCR.
Right. But I was asking if you'd be out of breath at the end of a 10-second sprint. Does running out of PCR cause breathlessness?
No, but it does cause fatigue.
Right, but that's not what I asked.
Okay.
I just asked for breathlessness. Breathlessness and fatigue are not the same thing. Fatigue is something's interrupting your muscle contraction process. Breathlessness is an increase in your breathing rate. Those two things are not the same. Okay, so if I ask you about breathlessness, I'm not asking you about fatigue. If I ask you about fatigue, I'm not asking about breathlessness. Okay, so my question was, if you do one 10-second sprint, will you be out of breath? And the answer should be no, because you're in the ATP PCR system. We talked about two things that increase your breathing rate. One is the carbon dioxide from the bicarbonate buffer, and the other was epinephrine. Okay, if you're doing one 10-second sprint, there's not a whole lot of epinephrine being released there. Okay, so you should not be breathless at the end of a 10-second sprint. Then, if you fully recover your 3 to 5 minutes, the end of your next 10-second sprint, you should also not be out of breath. If the person's out of breath, that tells you they're in glycolysis. They're not in ATP's PR system. So what do you need to do? If they're out of breath after their second sprint, what do you need to do?
Rest longer?
Yeah, so let's say they did their first 10-second sprint, they rested for 3 minutes, they did their second 10-second sprint, and they were out of breath. That means their ATP PCR system was not fully recovered. And if you want them only training in that system, you need to give them a longer rest. Some people it's 3 minutes, some people it's 4, some people it's 5, some people it might be 6 or 7. Okay, 3 to 5 is average. Okay, so you need to pay attention to the signs. Another way you can tell is if you're doing these repeats and you're giving 3 minutes of rest in between, I'm assuming you're timing their sprints. Okay, if they're doing, or if you're going by time, then you have to be measuring the distance. If you're going by distance, you have to be measuring the time. So let's say we're going by distance. They're doing a 100-meter sprint. Okay, the first time it takes them 12 seconds. The second time it takes them 14 seconds. What does that tell you?
They went into glycolysis.
They weren't fully recovered. Because if your system is fully recovered, you should be able to hit your max speed on every rep. Okay, and this will make more sense when we get to the resistance training.
Could you do this training all day long if you had accurate recovery or efficient or enough recovery?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know if you'd want to. But yeah, I mean, if you're giving yourself enough recovery to replenish your PCR, you'd have to eat occasionally and hydrate, but yeah. Okay, so if you train this way, let's talk about adaptations. Adaptations to training in the ATP PCR system would be hypertrophy. Muscles are going to respond Remember, these are your 2X fibers. When you train your 2X fibers, you challenge your 2X fibers, they respond with hypertrophy. That means they're going to get thicker, more dense, and they're going to be able to produce more force. Okay, we're going to talk more detail about hypertrophy in the next chapter, because there are ways you can hypertrophy without increasing strength. But this type of hypertrophy will increase strength. Okay, the thicker, more muscular, the thicker the muscle is, more actin and myosin it has, the more force it can produce. Okay, so the hypertrophy is the primary adaptation. Secondary to that, we will have an increase in strength. Will that affect performance on the Wingate test? Will it increase in strength, increase your power? In general, it should. What is power?
Well, if you're increasing like the size of your muscles, you're also increasing like the amount of like actin and myosin, which will be able to cross bridge and power stroke and create more force, basically.
Right, so we're creating more force, so that's strength. Does that translate into an increase in power? What is power?
Power is force times velocity. So an increase in force would increase power.
It's over time, force over time.
I have two different formulas for it.
Okay.
My 346 lab class.
Okay, so it's basically force over time. Okay, so if you can produce more force faster, that's going to come across as an increase in power, which is going to improve your performance on the Wingate test. Okay, so there are ways to train specifically for power. So strength doesn't always cross over into power equally. There are ways to specifically train for power, but an increase in strength, especially in a beginner, is going to cause also an increase in power, which is going to be improvement on the Wingate test. Okay, so that's it for adaptations for this system. No enzymatic adaptations, nothing else going on. Questions on that?
Will it affect any of our speed characteristics that we have for type 2X fibers like denser sarcoplasmic reticulum?
No.
Okay.
Is the time it takes to recover the system genetic?
The time it takes to recover the system does not change with training.
Then what determines it?
How quickly the body can reconstitute the PCR.
So does it change with training?
Not change with training. So that's a great question, because you might think that a person who trains in the system could stay in the system longer. Thank you for bringing that up, Armand. So if you train in the system, it does not make you able to stay in the system longer. Think about Usain Bolt. He trains the system for sure, but he doesn't do anything beyond a 200-meter sprint. If training in the system made him able to stay in the system longer, he'd be running the mile and beating everybody. But you cannot, even Usain Bolt cannot stay in the system longer. What he can do is produce more power than anybody else while he's in the system. Okay, so let's look at glycolysis.
I'm sorry, can you define peak power again?
Peak power is the highest power that's produced during that Wingate test,
Okay, thank you.
which happens in the first 10 seconds. Okay, glycolysis. Quick review. Where does it occur?
Sarcoplasm.
Substrate.
Carbohydrates, but technically glucose 6-phosphate.
Good. Rate limiting enzyme.
Also fructokinase.
Fructokinase. And byproduct.
2-pyruvate.
Okay.
Or
And what
did-
can that pyruvate become?
Either lactic acid or acetyl-CoA.
Good. So lactic acid becomes the byproduct. The pyruvate is the end product
Okay.
of glycolysis. I would refer to lactic acid as the byproduct. And we talked about 6 different possible fates of lactic acid. We talked about what affects the production of lactic acid, what increases the production of lactic acid. Okay, and we talked about how long you can stay in the system. And we said there wasn't a specific number. It kind of depends on how far above your lactate threshold you are, right? So there's a wide range for how long you can stay in the system. So give me an example of an exercise you could do in the system.
Like squat jumps?
Okay. Are we going for reps or time?
Time.
Okay, how long?
45 seconds.
How long?
Like 45.
Okay. Can someone give me another exercise?
Trail running.
Trail running will go in and out of glycolysis. I want an exercise that's specifically in anaerobic glycolysis.
Burpees.
Okay. Are we going for time or reps?
Time of 45 seconds to 1 minute.
Okay. Give me another one. I need like 6 or 7, so throw some out.
Mountain climbers.
Time or reps?
Time.
How long?
45 seconds to 60.
Okay, another one.
Battle ropes.
Reps or time?
Let's do time. 45 seconds.
Okay, what else?
Jumping jacks. for 60 seconds.
Okay, give me one more.
Bicep curls.
We're not doing resistance training here. We're doing high intensity interval training.
Oh yeah, that's good.
Would jump rope be glycolysis?
For most people. For some people, it's not. Let's get something a little harder. How do you know if the exercise you're doing is in glycolysis?
You're out of breath and your muscles are burning.
Yes.
Oh, what about a plank? Would that count or no?
For some people. Here's the thing. If it's above your lactate threshold, it's in glycolysis. If it's below your lactate threshold, it's not. So it's hard to have an exercise that's anaerobic for everyone unless it's a very hard exercise like squat jumps or burpees. Jumping jacks for a lot of people won't be anaerobic.
A sprint?
Okay, let's do a sprint. Distance or time?
Let's try a minute.
Okay, so you just built a workout for yourself. This is your workout for today. You have to do 45 seconds of squat jumps, immediately followed by 45 to 60 seconds of burpees, immediately followed by 45 to 60 seconds of mountain climbers, 45 seconds battle rope, 60 seconds of jumping jacks, and then a 60-second sprint, and then you've got to start immediately back at the squat jumps because we're going to repeat this 3 times. Is everybody okay with that?
We need breaks in between.
Oh, you think we need breaks? That's a good idea. So here's what happens a lot of the times when people try to build high intensity interval training workouts is they think the harder the better, the less rest the better, and they don't put in rest. And you go from one interval to the next, to the next, to the next without rest. And what happens when you do that is the intensity of the intervals drops down to aerobic level. Because if you're working anaerobically, you have to have rest, right? Because the lactic acid is going to accumulate and cause fatigue. So you cannot go from one exercise to the next, to the next, to the next, and have them all be high intensity exercises. That's no longer interval training. and that would turn aerobic. Okay, so your burpees would be so slow. By the time you finish 45 seconds of squat jumps, if you tried to go immediately into those burpees, you'd be doing them so slow, you'd be doing them as a recovery. Okay, you would not be able to go hard during that 45 seconds of burpees without taking rest here. Okay, so if it's high intensity interval training, the intervals are alternating between work and recovery. Okay, it doesn't have to be after every exercise. You get to decide how you're going to structure it and why you're going to structure it that way. So where do you guys want to put in rest?
Definitely after the squat jumps.
Okay, how long is your rest?
Maybe a minute and a half at least.
Okay, where else are we putting rest?
I would do it like after, so you do the squat jumps and then the burpees and then a rest. And then you do the mountain climbers, the battle ropes, and then a rest.
Okay.
So like you're splitting it up so like you have a minute and a half of like high intensity exercise and then you give yourself the rest.
Okay, and how long is this rest?
Not very long. I'm trying to remember the workout we did with you that one morning. Maybe
Anybody can chime in here. How long do you want this rest to be?
2 minutes.
2 minutes? Okay, so this is approximately 90 seconds of work, 2 minutes rest, and then you want the same rest here. Is that right? Yes? And then what? Again here? Do you want a longer rest here before we go back to the beginning? Or is it the same?
it would be longer if you wanted to make it like different sets.
Okay, so how long between sets?
Like 4 minutes?
Okay, so you have 45 seconds of squat jumps followed by 45 to 60 seconds of burpees. You have 2 minutes of rest. 45 second mountain climbers, 45 second battle rope, 2 minutes of rest, 60 seconds of jumping jacks, a 60-second sprint, 4 minutes rest before we start again. Is everybody okay with this? Does anybody want to change or add anything? No?
Well, for some people this might work, but I know for a fact that some general population people couldn't consistently perform at a consistent level. So they might need
45 seconds of squat jumps. I mean, we did squat jumps in class.
Yeah.
45 seconds of squat jumps is pretty intense. Okay. 45 seconds of burpees immediately following that, that's going to be hard. Not everybody's going to be able to do that, but we want it to be hard. But what would happen? How would this change the workout if we instead did um, 15 seconds here, 15 seconds here, and repeated like that? Would that change the workout? And then let's give 1 minute here. What if we did this workout the first way on Monday and this way on Wednesday? Is it going to feel different? I need you guys to engage with me here. Is one better than the other? Why would you choose to have a longer rest versus a shorter rest?
If you want to focus on like the actual execution of the exercises that you're doing rather than just getting it done.
Right. So the thing is, both ways we set it up, they'll both be in glycolysis. Would you agree? How long does it take to completely recover glycolysis?
30 minutes, right?
30 minutes, remember? Glycolysis causes a drop in pH. We said if you drop your pH down to intolerable levels, it takes 30 to 35 minutes to recover back to a normal pH. So whether you're taking 10 seconds rest or 30 seconds rest or a minute rest or 2 minutes rest, it's not complete rest. Assuming that you're working hard enough in the interval to drop your pH down significantly, which you should be. Otherwise, it's not an anaerobic interval, right? So you've got to work hard during the interval. Really, no matter how long you take in recovery, it's not going to be complete. So the question is, if you do a short recovery, it's not really a question. If you do a short recovery in between each exercise, like I set it up, each exercise is going to get progressively harder because you didn't take very much recovery. If you take a longer recovery in between work intervals, you're going to be able to work harder in each interval, okay? If you've never experienced this, it's going to be very difficult to understand the difference, okay? So please take some time to experience different types of high intensity interval workouts and see what they feel like, okay? So there's not a perfect work to rest ratio that I can prescribe that you should always do it this way. Sometimes you do 1 to 1, sometimes you do 2 to 1, sometimes you do 1 to 2. Sometimes the rest is longer than the work, sometimes the rest is shorter than the work. You change it around and it changes the workout. So we could keep this same workout that we wrote. And if you're training somebody, you don't necessarily have to stress out coming up with new exercises every time. Like if I'm training you every day, you don't have to worry about coming up with these brilliant new mind-blowing exercises every day. I can change the structure of it. One day I can do it with a long rest in between every 2 exercises. The next day I can do the same sequence of exercises with 15 seconds rest in between each exercise. It's gonna feel to you like a completely different workout, okay? One is not wrong, one is not better, they're different. Okay, and this will also make more sense when we get to resistance training also. But one way, if you take a longer rest so that you can work harder during the work interval, that's more likely to lead to mechanical fatigue. If you take a shorter rest so that each subsequent interval is getting harder, that's more likely to lead to metabolic fatigue, which triggers different pathways of adaptations, okay? Which you get into more detail of in 446, specifically with Dr. Nicole, okay? He'll take you specifically into the cellular signaling pathways. If you do it this way, you get this. If you do it this way, you get this, okay? There are reasons to do it both ways. I would suggest sometimes doing it one way, sometimes doing it the other, okay? Ariel, go ahead, you have a question?
But changing up like the pattern of like the exercise, like the exercises also change up the workout. Like instead of like having burpees right after the squat jumps, we can put in like jumping jacks or.
Sure. So there are a ton of things to consider when putting a workout together like that. I mean, we were just having different people throw in exercises. So you would want to consider if you want to be like, sometimes I'll do a lower body exercise, an upper body exercise, a cardio exercise, and then rest. And I'll structure it like that. Or you can do opposing exercises supersetted together, or you can do similar exercises that train the same muscle supersetted together. You know, depending, that's going to cause more metabolic fatigue because that muscle's not getting rest. If you work that muscle and then work a different muscle, like an upper body, lower body superset, then one's recovering while the other's working. Whereas if you do 2 pushing exercises back to back or 3 pushing exercises back to back, you're going to create more metabolic fatigue, right? So those are things to consider when you're putting it together as well. One is not bad, one is not good. You can try to create metabolic fatigue, you can try to create mechanical fatigue. These are things you should be thinking about. When you're putting workouts together like this, you shouldn't just be randomly throwing in exercises. You should be putting some thought into the sequence and a reason behind it, okay? So one thing, you guys were actually really good putting this together, is you stayed really consistent with how you're putting it together. Normally, when I do this, different people are throwing out exercises, and some people will do it by time, and some people will do it by reps, and some people will say 30 seconds, and some people say 60 seconds, and some people say 20 reps, and so the workout is just a mess. So another thing to think about when you're putting the workout together is to come up with some kind of structure, okay? Structure doesn't mean that all of the work intervals need to be the same length or the same reps. And it doesn't mean that you always have to do time, or always have to do reps, or always have to do distance. It just means come up with some kind of a structure. Because you can imagine if I said, okay, we're doing 20 burpees, and then we're doing 45 seconds of squat jumps, and then we're gonna rest for 30 seconds, and then we're gonna do a minute of something else, and then we're gonna do 20 seconds of something else. It's like, it's chaotic, and you can't wrap your brain around it. It makes the workout just not feel right, and it makes it drag on, right? You ever been at a workout where you feel like, wow, that went really fast, and another workout where it feels like, wow, I've been here for 3 hours? It has to do with the structure. Okay, if there's a structure, then it's easier to wrap your brain around it. It goes more smoothly. If you don't know what's coming up, it makes it drag out. So it's just another thing to consider when you're putting it together. You could do a structure of a pyramid where, and this could be by time or reps as well. You do one exercise here, 30 seconds, rest 30 seconds, do a different exercise here, 45 seconds, rest 30 seconds, do an exercise here, 60 seconds, rest, come back down to 45, come back down to 30. Okay, you could build this into a bigger, I started high, but you could start lower and build it into a bigger pyramid. You could just do the ascending side, you could just do the descending side, you do the ascending side and the descending side, all kinds of different ways to put something like this together. And those can all be different exercises, those can all be the same exercise. Just, these are all different things to think about, but you need to think about how this is going to affect the person that's doing it and what they're going to be feeling. And if you're doing a 45-second work interval with 15 seconds rest, you can't expect to get the same work level out of them for all of those work intervals. Does that make sense? With that little amount of rest, each one's going to get harder and harder. So the work product is going to go down. If you don't want the work product to go down, you give a longer rest. One of those is not wrong. They're just different. Does that make sense? You guys heard of Tabata? Tabata is an interval structure. It's 20 seconds of all-out work, followed by 10 seconds of recovery, repeated 8 times. Same exercise. By the time you finish the 4th round, it's incredibly intense. It's like putting rocks into your backpack every time, and it gets harder and harder and harder and harder. The results from that have in research have been shown to be phenomenal. And that's where the metabolic training idea comes in. It's super, super, super high intensity interval training that gives you the massive epoch after that lasts, like we said, for a day or two after. Huge results from this. Okay, any questions how to structure it, why to structure it, what exercises to choose? You could put in resistance training exercises in here. That's just not what we're doing right now, but you could certainly put resistance training exercise in there, but expect that the heart rate's going to drop down because it's no longer high intensity. This is like cardio type thing. Any questions on any of that? Okay, let's talk about adaptations if you train this way. Hypertrophy. Your muscles will hypertrophy in response to this type of training. That's the primary adaptation. Okay, secondary to that, just like in the ATP PCR system, you will get an increased strength and increased power. So will this improve your performance on the Wingate test?
Yes.
Yes.
It will. Increase in strength and power will increase your peak power, which will increase your mean power. Okay. Another adaptation. Increased carbonate buffer. Okay, bless you. Since we mentioned the buffer, let's write it out. How do we write the buffer?
HCO3.
Okay, that's the buffer itself. What does it do?
It binds with a hydrogen
The hydrogen,
to create H2CO3, which is carbonic acid,
carbonic acid, and then it splits into
H2O, and non-metabolic carbon dioxide.
good. So as a result of this type of high intensity interval training, you get more bicarbonate buffer. What's secondary to that? What does that do for you?
It helps you clear lactic acid.
Yes, which does what? It increases your
Lactate threshold.
lactate threshold. So an increase in lactate threshold is not a primary adaptation. Okay, the increase in bicarbonate buffer is the primary adaptation, which causes an increase in lactate threshold. Okay, third adaptation here. Increased glycolytic enzymes. Name some glycolytic enzymes.
Hexokinase.
Hexokinase.
Phosphofructokinase.
Good.
Glycogenolysis.
That's not an enzyme.
Oh yeah.
Glycogen phosphorylase.
Glycogen phosphorylase. Lactate dehydrogenase. Those are all glycolytic enzymes. So you get more of those. It makes this system more efficient. You can produce the ATP faster. So comparing this, adaptations for training this system to adaptations in training ATP PCR system. What are your thoughts? What do you notice? Rachel, go ahead.
So I do notice there's quite a few more adaptations that you gain from this. In addition, we have increases in strength as well as power, and then like the bicarbonate buffer and the enzymes. So it seems like overall, like we're going to be working more efficiently since we're having adaptations at all the levels of our metabolic pathways.
Right. So adaptations to the PCR system was just the hypertrophy. We can get that in glycolysis plus added adaptations, which will improve performance, right? So there's not really a reason to train specifically in the ATP PCR system, especially if it's going to upset your client. You're spending so much time resting, right? It's a really boring way to work out. There's not a reason to do that. It doesn't give you any advantages over training glycolysis, except I would put an exception to that, except if you're training a competitive athlete whose sport is in that system. Then they need to spend some time training specifically that system. Okay, but for an average person, there's zero reason to do that. You can get the same adaptations plus more training glycolysis, and it's more fun and more interesting. Okay, questions on that? Both types of training will improve your performance on the Wingate test.
Would you do ATP PCR training for both endurance athletes and anaerobic based athletes?
So that's a great question. Will these types of training affect endurance performance? Will these types of training affect sprint performance? So let's start with the sprinting. Let's say your client is a sprinter. They run the 100 and the 200. Will training in the ATP PCR system improve their 100-meter sprint? Will they be able to sprint faster in the 100 meters?
Yes.
Okay. Why?
Because they have more power output because of the hypertrophy that we get with the ATP PCR training.
Good. So Training in the ATP PCR system would give you hypertrophy, which would increase your strength and power, which is going to increase your speed as well. So that should really say strength, speed, and power. It can increase your speed, which is going to increase your performance on a sprint. Okay. Would training in glycolysis improve your performance in a 100-meter sprint?
Yes.
Yes. Why?
Let's see. I feel weird. I don't want to be the only one talking. I think it would, because in addition, we also increase the bicarbonate buffer. So, I mean, like, if you're just doing like a 100-meter sprint, like that doesn't really come into play in your event. But like, if you're a 400-meter sprinter, then that will come into play, and that'll help you with, even though technically that's more distance, but.
Okay. So right now I'm just talking about the 100-meter sprint.
Okay.
Will training in glycolysis improve your 100-meter sprint time?
Yes.
Why?
Because you still have the increased adaptations of strength and power, and you're improving those glycolytic enzymes. But are you even using those glycolytic enzymes in ATP PCR though? You're not.
You're still in the ATPCR, right? For the 100-meter. So glycolysis doesn't involve in the 100-meter.
Huh. So yes and no.
Interesting.
Wouldn't our lactic threshold increase? So that could potentially influence how you perform on the 100-meter.
How would the bicarbonate buffer affect your 100-meter sprint performance?
But the 100-meter isn't for that long. You wouldn't even hit your, like, you wouldn't be out of breath for 100-meter, because it's not, I don't think it's that long of a sprint.
So
You
100
shouldn't be
meters,
back.
yeah, 100 meters is like 9 to 15 seconds. All out sprint. It's in the ATP PCR system. So we determined that training in the ATP PCR system is going to improve performance on the 100-meter sprint, because it's going to give you hypertrophy, which gives you an increase in strength, power, and speed. So you can run fast, you can sprint faster if you train that way. Now the question is, if we train in glycolysis, will that improve our 100-meter sprint speed?
Yes, because it still includes hypertrophy.
Yeah, so even the glycolysis adaptation is still going to be hypertrophy, which is increased power and strength.
So like training glycolysis gives us that same hypertrophy that training in ATP PCR does. So even though we're training in a different system than the 100-meter sprint is in, it's still going to affect our performance, because the hypertrophy will increase our strength, speed, and power. Will the bicarbonate buffer affect the 100-meter sprint?
No.
It won't. Will the glycolytic enzymes affect the 100-meter sprint? It won't, because those aren't used in the 100-meter sprint in ATP PCR. Does everybody understand that? This is where we get to the critical thinking application of these concepts. Okay. Let's look at, let me ask you this. Would endurance training affect your 100-meter sprint time?
I mean, you'd be able to you would produce less lactic acid because you're working primarily aerobically, so you're able to keep your mitochondria availability open. So
it gives you so it gives you a higher lactate threshold. Does a higher lactate threshold improve your 100-meter sprint performance?
No.
Why not?
Because you're not even hitting your lactate threshold at a 100-meter sprint. Like, you're not.
What do you mean you're not hitting it?
I mean, like, for that, like the adaptations that would come for endurance training, would it increase the lactate threshold? So you'd be less fatigued for the sprint?
Does lactate threshold, does having a higher lactate threshold improve your sprint performance on a 100-meter sprint in the ATP PCR system?
Well, you're not accumulating lactic acid, so.
Why not?
Because you're only working for 10 to 15 seconds and your substrate is phosphocreatine, so you're not even using glycogenolysis.
So where are you on this drawing?
You're below your lactate threshold.
In your max sprint, you're down here?
No, never mind, you're above
I
it.
think it would help help for your 100-meter sprint because you could let me
You
see.
increase the lactate threshold, right? So if you were training, if you were doing your 100-meter sprint, you wouldn't hit it until longer, right?
But you're going at a fast or at a higher intensity. So you can go at a higher intensity.
Where
Like
on this continuum of
the
intensity is your 100-meter sprint? Is it at your lactate threshold? Is it below your lactate threshold? Is it a little bit above your lactate threshold, or is it way above your lactate threshold? Your all-out sprint.
All-out sprint would be way above.
Maximal intensity.
Right.
Does your lactate threshold affect your performance at your max intensity?
No, because you're above it.
Yeah.
Yeah, this lactate threshold is going to affect something like if you're comfortable in steady state at 6 miles per hour, but you increase to 7 miles per hour and you become uncomfortable, that's because of your lactate threshold. If you're sprinting at 15 miles per hour, it doesn't matter if you start getting out of breath at 7 miles per hour. You're sprinting all out max. Has nothing to do with your lactate threshold. Your lactate threshold has to do with the highest intensity you can maintain aerobically. That's aerobic fitness. Okay, we're out of time. So you guys are gonna have to remind me how far we got into this discussion, because we gotta continue with this discussion and go through the different types of training and the different types of performance and see how they affect each other before we go into chapter 11, but we don't have a lot of time. So please remind me where we left off on this. Please put some thought into this. Actually, take a look at an event. So we just looked at an event in the ATP PCR system. Our event was a 100-meter sprint. We looked at how training an ATP PCR system would affect that, how glycolysis training would affect that, how aerobic training would affect that. Then I want you to look at a glycolysis activity, such as a 400-meter sprint, which takes about a minute. How would ATP PCR training affect that? How would glycolysis training affect that? How would aerobic training affect that? And then take an endurance event, like a 5K, a 3-mile run, assuming it's flat. How is ATP PCR training going to affect that? How is glycolysis training going to affect that? How is aerobic training going to affect that? We'll discuss all of that and then we'll get into resistance training. Okay, please put some thought into that before we come in for Wednesday. Okay, if you have any questions, you can stick around. I have office hours at 11 or go to your workshop, whatever you need to do. Otherwise, have a great day.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
You're welcome.